A 6-year-old girl walked up to my bench holding a piece of paper. It was folded in half. One corner was bent. There was a smudge of grape juice near the bottom. She held it in both hands the way children hold things that matter to them, carefully, with her whole body involved. Her mother had just testified for 14 minutes, carefully, nervously, in accented English she'd worked hard to perfect. The landlord's attorney had just spent 11 minutes explaining, with the practiced ease of a man who has never been cold in his life, that the heating system had been inspected, certified compliant, and was functioning within what he kept calling normal parameters. 2 adults had argued. Documents had been entered. Expert language had been used. And the truth, the actual lived truth of what happened in that apartment was losing to paperwork. And then this girl, this quiet, serious girl with a ponytail and sneakers that lit up when she walked, held up a drawing she'd made with crayons. And everything both sides had argued became irrelevant. I'm going to show you that drawing. But I need to tell you what led to it first, because the drawing only destroys you if you understand what that child had been living through. The mother's name was Yelena Kozar, 33 years old. She had come to this country from Bosnia 8 years ago, alone, with a daughter who was then a baby, and a marriage that had ended badly enough that she didn't talk about it. She worked as a home health aide during the day, bathing, lifting, feeding elderly patients who couldn't do it themselves. And she was good at it, the way people who've survived hard things are often good at taking care of others. She rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a brick building downtown, Unit 4A on the 4th floor. She'd lived there 5 years. The rent was tight, but manageable on her salary if nothing went wrong, which is the financial reality of most of the people in my courtroom. One unexpected cost away from crisis, held together by routine and discipline and the absence of bad luck. The neighborhood was safe enough. The elementary school was 3 blocks away, which meant her daughter Mila could walk while Yelena was already at her first patient's house by 7 a.m. That proximity, 3 blocks, a 6-year-old's walking distance, was why Yelena had chosen the apartment and why she'd stayed, even when staying meant other things she shouldn't have had to endure. The landlord was a man named Victor Shell, 57. He owned 11 residential buildings across the city. Not luxury, not slums, the gray middle, where tenants pay enough to deserve better and don't get it because nobody's watching. Shell's buildings were the kind where the hallway lights worked most of the time, and the super answered the phone sometimes, and the heat came on in October if you were lucky, and November if you weren't. Unit 4A's heat hadn't come on at all. Not in October, not in November, not in December. Yelena had called. She called the super 14 times over 3 months. Each one logged on her phone's call history, which she'd printed out. She'd called Shell's management office 7 times. She'd sent written requests, 3 of them, carefully photocopied before mailing, with dates, because a woman who came to this country alone with a baby learns fast that if you don't keep copies, the system will pretend you never asked. She'd done everything a tenant is supposed to do when the heat doesn't work. And she'd done it patiently, politely, repeatedly, the way a person does when they've been taught that the system works if you follow the steps. The system didn't work. Nobody came. The heat stayed off. And Yelena Kozar and her 6-year-old daughter Mila spent December through February in a 4th-floor apartment with no heat in a city where the winter gets to 11 degrees. I want you to understand what no heat means when it's real. It doesn't mean chilly. It doesn't mean wearing a sweater indoors. It means waking up at 3 a.m. because the cold has crept through the blankets and your child is shivering next to you. It means boiling water on the stove to create steam because someone on the internet said it helps. It means your daughter does her homework in gloves. It means you layer every piece of clothing you own on a 6-year-old who doesn't understand why the apartment hurts. Yelena bought 2 space heaters. They cost her $140 she didn't have. They raised the temperature in the bedroom to about 51 degrees, livable barely if you don't move out from under the blankets. The electric bill tripled. The money came from the food budget, which meant rice and bread for 3 months, which meant Yelena lost 11 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. She didn't stop calling. She didn't stop documenting. Every single week, she wrote a note with the date and the indoor temperature measured with a $3 thermometer from the pharmacy. And here is the detail that I keep thinking about. She held the thermometer at child height, not at adult chest level, where the air is warmer, where an official measurement would be taken. She held it at 3 feet, at the level where Mila breathed and slept and did her homework in fingerless gloves that Yelena had cut from an old pair of socks because children's gloves don't come in a version you can write with. And then, in February, when the pipes in Unit 4A finally froze and burst and flooded the kitchen at 2 a.m., and she carried her daughter out of the apartment in pajamas into a hallway that was barely warmer, she stopped being patient. She filed a complaint, she withheld rent, and when Shell's management company responded by starting eviction proceedings against her for non-payment, she filed a counterclaim for habitability violations. And that is how Yelena Kozar ended up in my courtroom, holding a folder of call logs and temperature notes, with a 6-year-old girl sitting in the gallery drawing quietly while the adults argued about whether her apartment was cold. Victor Shell's attorney was a man named Philip Breck, experienced, efficient, the kind of landlord's lawyer who has defended habitability complaints 100 times and knows exactly how to make a freezing apartment sound like a matter of professional opinion. His argument was this: the heating system in the building had been inspected by a licensed technician on November 15th, and the inspection report, which he entered into evidence, stated that the system was operational and within normal parameters. Any issues in Unit 4A, he suggested, were likely the result of tenant-caused obstruction of vents or radiators, or the natural temperature variation in upper floor units. He said within normal parameters 3 times. He said it the way people say things they want the room to accept without examining. I looked at the inspection report. It was real. It was signed by a licensed technician. It did say what Breck said it said. And Shell himself, when asked to testify, did something I've seen 100 times from landlords in habitability cases. He performed concern. He leaned forward. He furrowed his brow. He said he took tenant comfort very seriously. He said he was surprised to hear about the issue because, to his knowledge, the heating system was functioning correctly. He said, "The heat works fine. If there was a problem, my office would have addressed it. The heat works fine," said by a man who owned 11 buildings and had not personally set foot in Unit 4A at any point during the 3 months it was freezing. I want to say something about Victor Shell that complicates the easy version. I do not think he was a man who wanted a child to shiver. I think he was a man who had 11 buildings and had learned over years to manage them the way you manage a spreadsheet. Cells and numbers, not people and temperatures. Somewhere in the distance between his office and Unit 4A, the fact that a 6-year-old was doing homework in gloves had become an abstraction, a complaint ticket, a line on a report. The cruelty was not intentional. It was structural, the kind that happens when a person with power stops visiting the places where their decisions land. He didn't hate Yelena Kozar. He had simply, efficiently, completely stopped seeing her, which, if you think about it, is its own kind of cruelty, the kind you can commit without ever raising your voice. Yelena testified she brought her call log, 14 calls to the super, 7 to management, printed from her phone. She brought her 3 written requests, photocopied. She brought her weekly temperature notes, each one dated, each one showing a number in the low 40s. And Breck did what Breck does. He suggested the thermometer was inaccurate. He suggested the written requests might have been created after the fact. He didn't accuse her of lying. He was too smart for that. But he eroded gently, patiently, the way water erodes rock. He made it sound like maybe she was exaggerating. Maybe the apartment was cool, not cold. Maybe the situation was uncomfortable, not dangerous. It's a technique, and it works more often than it should, because when one side has a licensed inspection report and the other side has a mother's handwritten notes, the room tends to lean toward the paper with the official stamp. I could feel the case tilting, not toward truth, toward documents, toward the version with the official stamp, the one that looked more like a fact because it was formatted like one. I have watched this happen 100 times. The licensed report beats the handwritten note. The expert beats the person who lived through it. And the system works exactly as designed, which is not the same thing as working correctly. I want to be precise about what happened next, because very little surprises me in this room anymore. This surprised me. And then Yelena's attorney, a quiet young woman named Anna Petrov, said, "Your Honor, I have one more witness." I said, "Who?" She said, "Mila Kozar. She's 6 years old. She'd like to show you something she made." Shell's attorney objected immediately. A 6-year-old is not a competent witness. This is irregular. This is emotional manipulation. I overruled him. Here is the thing about children in courtrooms, and it is something every judge knows but rarely says out loud. A child is the most dangerous witness in any proceeding, not because they are dramatic, but because they are literal. An adult witness interprets, editorializes, performs, hedges. A child describes what happened the way it happened, without knowing which parts are supposed to be softened for the room. They do not manage their testimony. They answer the question. And that directness, that inability to be strategic about the truth, makes them devastating. I said Mila could approach, and I said I would speak to her myself. Mila walked up from the gallery. She had dark hair in a ponytail. She wore a pink sweater and those sneakers, the ones that light up with every step, pink and purple flashes against the courtroom floor. She was small enough that the microphone was above her head. I leaned forward so she wouldn't have to strain. I said, "Hi, Mila. You don't have to be scared. I just want to talk to you for a minute. Is that okay?" She nodded. I said, "Your mom told me it was cold in your apartment this winter. Can you tell me about that?" She said, "It was really cold. I could see my breath when I talked." 6 words, not rehearsed, not coached, just a child remembering what her bedroom felt like. Just that. 5 words and a fact. I could see my breath inside her home. I said, "I heard you made a drawing. Would you like to show me?" She nodded again, and she unfolded the piece of paper she'd been holding and held it up. It was a crayon drawing, a child's drawing, the kind with a wobbly rectangle for the building and stick figures and a yellow circle for the sun. Except in this drawing, there was no sun. The sky was scribbled in dark blue and purple. The building was brown. And inside the building, in a small square that was clearly meant to be a room, there were 2 stick figures lying in a bed together under a pile of what I counted as 7 blankets. She had drawn each one in a different color, layered on top of each other. Beside the bed, on the floor, she had drawn a small orange rectangle with red squiggles coming off the top, wavy lines meant to represent heat, a space heater, the only source of warmth in the drawing. The only warm color in it, actually. Everything else was blue and purple and brown. Winter colors, cold colors, except for this small, brave, orange rectangle, doing its best against an apartment that a grown man with 11 buildings had decided wasn't his problem. And above the two figures in the bed, she had written in large, careful, 6-year-old capital letters, "We were so cold, Mommy cried." I read those words, and something happened in my chest that I cannot describe to you professionally. Something between anger and heartbreak and the absolute certainty that I was looking at the most honest piece of evidence that had been presented in my courtroom in months. No licensed technician signed this. No attorney prepared it. A 6-year-old drew it because it was true, and she didn't know how to lie about it, and she didn't know there was a reason to. I looked at Victor Schell. He was staring at the drawing. His attorney had gone very quiet. I looked at Yelena. She had both hands pressed over her mouth, tears running silently down her face, not because she was performing, but because her daughter had just told a room full of strangers that she'd heard her mother cry from the cold. And some things, when your child says them out loud, break you open regardless of where you are. I held the drawing up so the whole courtroom could see it. I said, "Mr. Schell, you told me the heat works fine. Your technician's report says within normal parameters, and I'm holding a drawing by a 6-year-old girl who lived in your building, who drew herself under 7 blankets next to a space heater, and who wrote, in the handwriting of a child who was just learning how, that her mother cried because they were so cold." I set the drawing down. I believe the child, Mr. Schell. I believe her over your report, over your technician, and over you, because a 6-year-old doesn't know what normal parameters means. She only knows what cold feels like. And cold that makes your mother cry is not within any parameter I recognize. Schell opened his mouth. His attorney put a hand on his arm, the universal gesture of "don't make it worse." For once, he listened. I ruled. The eviction was dismissed. Yelena Kozar had withheld rent because her apartment was uninhabitable and she was within her rights. Her counterclaim was upheld. I ordered Schell to make immediate repairs to the heating system in Unit 4A with verification by an independent inspector within 14 days. I awarded Yelena the cost of the space heaters, the inflated electric bills for 3 months, and damages for the habitability violation at the maximum the range allows, because 3 months of a child shivering in her own bed is not an oversight, it is neglect, and the law knows the difference. The total was just over $12,000, less than 1 month's rent on one of Victor Schell's nicer units. Less than nothing to a man who owned 11 buildings. Everything to a woman who would cut socks into fingerless gloves so her daughter could do homework in the cold. And I made one more order. I directed that a copy of Mila's drawing be attached to the permanent case file, not as decoration, but as evidence, so that anyone who ever opened this file would see, before they read a single word of legal argument, what within normal parameters looked like through the eyes of a child who lived through it. Yelena collected her daughter at the gallery bench. Mila had gone back to drawing, a new one, this time with a yellow sun and green grass, the optimism of a child who doesn't stay angry, who trusts that the cold is over because somebody finally listened. Yelena held her daughter's hand and walked out of my courtroom. And as she passed the bench, Mila looked up at me and waved, a small, shy wave, pink light-up sneakers flashing against the floor. I waved back, a small gesture, the smallest thing, and I am not sure any moment on this bench, in all these years, in all these cases, has ever asked less of me or given me more. If Mila's drawing moved you, the most powerful thing you can do with it is talk about it. Leave a comment. Share this. Let it reach someone who needs to hear it. Maybe a tenant right now, sitting in a cold apartment thinking nobody cares. Maybe a landlord who needs the reminder that someone is always watching, even if it's someone who's only 6. And if you'd like to follow along with more of these, you're welcome to become a channel member. It's just a way to hear the next story a little sooner. No pressure. Watching, caring, and passing it on is already everything. Now tell me something in the comments. A 6-year-old drew 7 blankets, a space heater, and 1 sentence. We were so cold, Mommy cried. And it did more damage to a landlord's defense than any inspection report or licensed technician ever could. So here's my question. What would your 6-year-old self have drawn about your life? The thing the adults argued about in complicated language, what did it look like from down there, from kid height? Tell me, because the truth is usually simpler than we make it, and the person closest to the floor usually sees it clearest. Victor Schell said, "The heat works fine." A child with crayons proved it didn't. And the only piece of paper in that courtroom that told the whole truth didn't have a signature, a stamp, or a license number. It had 7 blankets and 1 sentence a 6-year-old wrote because she didn't know how to lie about the cold. Dramatization for storytelling and education, not legal advice.